Having molten gold poured down your throat must be a bad way to go. But we imagine having an elephant with blades attached to its feet kicking you around like a soccer ball isn't much fun either. As for having your ribs pulled through your back or rats eating your face, well, that would be grim. So buckle in and prepare to be disturbed beyond belief. Number 10. Imagine being cooked alive inside a bronze animal as purposefully made organs in the device carry your howls around the room. Inside this room, the man who ordered your extremely painful execution rejoices at the sound of your agonizing screams. Could there be anything more demented? This was the method of execution called the brazen bull. But did it actually happen? That's hard to say. But if you believe an ancient Greek historian named Diodorus Siculus, it did. He wrote 40 books that were called the Bibliotheca Historica, and in chapter 9, pages 18 to 19, he recounts this strange method of capital punishment. In short, the bronze bull was an oven of sorts. It was supposed to be about the size of a regular bowl and made out of bronze. Once the person was placed inside it, a fire was lit underneath. But the craziest part was the tubes fixed to the bull that would make it so the howling of the victim could be heard in all its horror. The guy who first used it was named Phalaris, a tyrant who from around 570 to 554 BC had a run of the island we now call Sicily. He was apparently renowned for his extreme cruelty, at times taking much pleasure from acts of cannibalism. As the story goes, a sculptor from Athens named Paralaus constructed the bull for this baby-eating tyrant, and on seeing that it was fitted with acoustic pipes, Phalaris was made up with the artisan. Paralaus said to Phalaris, "His screams will come to you through the pipes as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowing." But it seems that Paralaus didn't much like this bit of showing off by the sculptor, so he tricked him into getting inside. Without breaking a smile, he said to Paralaus, "Come then, Paralaus, you be the first to illustrate this. Imitate those who will play the pipes and make it clear to me the working of your device." After Paralaus got inside, Phalaris lit the fire himself to see if the music of the tortured indeed filled his ears. Before Paralaus was dead, he was taken out of the bull and subsequently dragged to a cliff where he was thrown to his death. He did this because he didn't want Paralaus's body leaving marks on what was otherwise a spotless bull. The brazen bull was also talked about a fair bit in the years after. The Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero had something to say about it. Phalaris has said to have had, into which he was accustomed to put men for punishment and to put fire under. There was also talk of persecuted Christians going this way, but it's more likely that those legends were far from the truth. If the insanely cruel Phalaris story is true, is also a long shot. The historical documents exist, but some scholars say it might have been a bit of ancient propaganda, saying that, given other forms of abject cruelty that went on back then, there's no reason to think someone wasn't ever roasted inside a bull. The first thing that springs to mind is what kind of sicko came up with this next one. Number 9. We know this one happened, and it happened a lot because it was written into Roman law. It was called the poena culiae, and was usually reserved for people who killed their father, aka patricide. Poena culiae was literally the penalty of the sack, which in its early days around 100 to 200 BC might have simply consisted of tying a person up in a sack and throwing them into a body of water. But that was the early days. The Romans got more sadistic at some point. Killing any parent is called parricide, and according to the historians, the Romans saw this one as one of the most monstrous things a person could do. So in accordance with such monstrousness, the punishment had to be equally horrific. First, a person was beaten with rods. His head was then placed in a hood made with wolf skin, and wooden shoes were fitted to him, not unlike the cement shoes the mafia used many years later. He was then placed inside a large sack made from ox leather. But the pièce de résistance was what happened next. As the man was bleeding heavily inside of his sack, animals were thrown in. It might have been a dog, a monkey, a cock, a snake, or some combination. The sack with its now no doubt confused contents was driven on a cart to a river or a pond into which the sack was dumped. So, the victim didn't just drown but spent the last minutes of his life likely fighting off a bunch of animals in an enclosed space. According to one historian, the animals didn't go quietly and they would lacerate and torture the doomed wretch within. That would have had to have been a really big sack. But historians tell us that the Romans had plenty of these at hand, since they were used to contain wine. As mad as it sounds, the Romans believed that such a punishment was required for a crime they said was a foul thing, unclean, causing the gods to withdraw their presence from a world he polluted. Cicero, who was beheaded himself after getting on the wrong side of Mark Antony, said getting rid of a person this way meant they wouldn't contaminate anything. He said you couldn't just kill a man who committed such a terrible crime because his blood would contaminate the ground. You couldn't just throw him into the sea with no sack because his body would contaminate the water. Cicero even said that you couldn't feed the guy to the beasts because the animals could get contaminated. Putting the condemned into a sack meant separating them from nature, even though we know that that was a pretty silly thing to think. The Roman historian we know as Livy wrote about this in the History of Rome, saying that it happened to a man named Marcus Publicus Malleus after he was convicted of killing his mother, aka matricide. He got the clogs and the sack treatment, but in his case, it seems he didn't get the animal treatment. The Romans wrote the punishment into their laws, bodies of rules you might have heard in the form of Lex Pompeia or Lex Cornelia, both of which talk about the poena culiae. And being a formal law, it happened a lot. When Seneca the Younger wrote about it, he said Emperor Claudius was really fond of putting men in the sack. So much so, he was ordering more poena culiae than was crucifixion. Interestingly, his father, Seneca the Elder, thought it was worse than crucifixion. He lived through times when there were some utterly terrible tyrants, so he witnessed a lot of men going down to the bottom of a river in a sack filled with animals. About that, he wrote, "I kept imagining the culius, the snake, the deep." Some scholars seem to think it went obsolete around that time, but that contradicts a letter that Emperor Constantine sent on November 16, 318. Writing about parricides, he said, "He will not be punished by the sword, by fire, or by some other ordinary form of execution, but he will be sewn up in a sack, and in this dismal prison have serpents as his companions. Depending on the nature of the locality, he shall be thrown into the neighboring sea or into the river." You can find it again in laws from the 500s, written under Emperor Justinian, but it seems it was already thought of as archaic by that time. Still, it seems it reappeared in Germany in the 14th century and might have happened as early as the 18th century, although cats and dogs were the animals used, or possibly a non-venomous snake. In one documented case in Germany, the sack split after hitting the water, and the cat and the dog swam away as the man drowned. Can we top that? Of course we can. Number 8. Could there be a more fitting way to execute a greedy person than pouring molten gold into their mouth? You might have seen something similar to this on TV, Game of Thrones perhaps. But the scenes on TV didn't just come out of thin air. One such real story says that in the 16th century, a Spanish conquistador named Pedro de Valdivia had been fighting the indigenous Mapuche people in Chile and had come undone. Instead of getting their gold, he fled on horseback after losing a battle. His horse got caught in a marsh and he was subsequently taken back to the heads of the tribe to face the music. There is no doubt this man died at the hands of the Mapuche. Sources differ, though, as to how he died. He might have merely gone the regular way of having his heart ripped out. In that account, the Mapuche leaders ate the heart. But according to another conquistador, Pedro Marina de Lobera, they took their hostage and poured molten gold down his throat. This was a symbolic kind of death, although scientists who've actually had the time to think about it have said it would have been over very quickly. The steam would rupture the organs, and the thermal injury to the lungs would be pretty much instant death from pulmonary dysfunction and shock. Within a matter of seconds, you'd have a dead conquistador, but you'd also easily be able to take back the now hardened gold. In fact, if those Mapuche really knew what they were doing, they'd have fed him tiny bits of molten gold to allow the torture to last longer. As for this ever being written into any kind of law, we need to invoke Emperor Constantine again. He had it written into his raptus statutes as the punishment for when a nurse failed to protect a female slave from being stolen by a man. The law stated that the man should be burned at the stake, and if the slave was actually trying to escape with him, she should also be burned. But if the nurse was somehow involved in helping that man steal the slave, she should have molten lead poured down her throat. We are not kidding. Here's part of the actual statute. These nurses, first of all, whose service is proved to have been hateful and whose talk is proved to have been bought, this punishment shall threaten that the opening of their mouth and of their throat, which brought forth destructive encouragements, shall be closed by the swallowing of molten lead. But in general, there aren't too many cases of this happening throughout history. There's another case dated 1599 which involved a Spanish governor in Ecuador who again got this symbolic treatment largely because of his greed and lust for gold. It was written that no sooner than he swallowed the gold, his internal organs burst. As you know, many years later, scientists said this would have indeed happened. And now, we need to talk about scaphism. Number 7. Scaphism comes from the Greek word for boat. So, this punishment is sometimes simply just called the boats. Ah, the boats. It sounds so nice. It's not. The only story we have doesn't come from the actual executors, but a man writing about his long-term enemy. That man was the Greek historian Plutarch, telling the story of how vile and inhumane the ancient Persians could be at times. For this reason, we have to at least wonder if it was a work of propaganda. Anyway, in his work called The Life of Artaxerxes, Plutarch writes that a guy named Mithridates committed the worst possible crime, and so the punishment had to fit it. Mithridates was a mere soldier working on behalf of King Artaxerxes. After Artaxerxes' father, King Darius II, died, there'd been a bit of a struggle for the throne with his brother Cyrus, and for 401 BC, Cyrus got the upper hand in a battle against his brother's army, but while he was charging down the battlefield on his horse telling his now kneeling enemies to get out of the way, Mithridates stood up and threw a dart at him. It hit him somewhere in the temple and knocked him off his horse, with his death coming soon after. Artaxerxes got wind of this and apparently showered Mithridates with gifts. The king then said to Mithridates something along the lines of, "Let's just keep this between us. I killed Cyrus, not you, okay? Got that? Me, not you." It was agreed that Mithridates was to say he was given the gifts for trapping the horse and knocking Cyrus off, but not for killing him. As things tend to happen after a good battle, later at a banquet, Mithridates had a little too much to drink, and when speaking to a eunuch, he said, "Perhaps too much." When the eunuch complimented him for trapping the horse, Mithridates angrily retorted, "Talk what you please of horse trappings and such trifles. I declare to you explicitly that this hand was the death of Cyrus." He then put his killer hand in front of the eunuch's face. Word soon got back to Artaxerxes about his ungrateful and insolent soldier, and soon he ordered Mithridates' execution. And what a death it was! Mithridates was placed between two boats in the water, one on top of the other. His head and arms and legs were placed through holes, so it was as if he was in a kind of coffin suit. He was then force-fed, and if he declined the food, they pricked his eyes. The text doesn't state what instrument did the pricking, which is kind of important. After that, they poured milk and honey not only into his mouth but all over his face, and as he lay there in the sun like this, all bloated from being force-fed, with his poop and vomit everywhere, flies and other insects covered him. We'll let Plutarch himself describe this next part. Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. When the man is manifestly dead, the uppermost boat being taken off, they find his flesh devoured and swarms of such noisome creatures preying upon and, as it were, growing to his innards. Mithridates apparently lasted 17 days like this before he died. Maybe Plutarch was telling the truth, but whether these insects devoured Mithridates' insides is certainly up for debate. He would have just died anyway from being left out onto the elements. Now let's see about as bad as punishment ever got in China. Number 6. The Chinese have a shocking history of torture that involved quite unbelievable methods of execution, perhaps even worse than that of the Europeans. You've no doubt all heard of the death of 1,000 cuts, which wasn't often as many as 1,000 cuts. Still, there are documents that tell us sometimes the operation would purposefully be done as slow as possible, and to think, the last cases of this happening in China were in the 20th century. Ling Chi, aka slow slicing, was a pretty common form of execution throughout China for many centuries. The best a victim could hope for would be either bribing the executioner to get hold of some pain relief, or perhaps being able to pay enough to ensure the executioner sliced through something that would ensure a fast death. Still, it was also known as the lingering death, so at times many cuts were made while the person was still conscious. The executioners would usually start taking thick chunks of flesh from the victim's arms and chest, and then move down to the legs. In the end, the arms were hacked off and so was the head, just to ensure the afterlife wasn't that much fun. It would usually take around 15 minutes, although there are some reports that state as many as 3,000 cuts were made before death occurred. We'd guess they were very small cuts. Now for something even more extreme than that. Number 5. We haven't finished with China yet because things actually got worse than Ling Chi. To explain this, we'll have to talk about a very respected Chinese man born sometime around 280 BC. His name was Li Si. During the Qin dynasty, this guy was renowned for his philosophical writings as well as his political intelligence, which is why at one point he became the chancellor, which back then was kind of a prime minister to the emperor. Li Si wrote beautifully and had grand ideas about how society and indeed the world should be run, with one historian saying Li Si wrote about one world comprising all Chinese, bringing with universal dominion universal peace. But this man, one of the most remarkable men in Chinese history, in short, had some problems after one of the emperors died. During a tricky succession period, he was betrayed by another politician named Cao Gao. Li Si was at first tortured so Cao Gao could understand who was on whose sides during all this tumult. He was subjected to something called the 5 punishments, which was about as bad as it got in ancient China. And to be fair to the Romans, it made fighting a monkey in a submerged sack seem like a holiday. The least painful part of the 5 punishments was merely the tattooing of the condemned person's face. This was a bit like branding in the Middle Ages. In some cases, the man got his tattoo and walked around with a mark of shame on him. But for more serious cases, there was a nose removal, which again meant you had to go out in public and everyone knew you'd done something wrong. Worse was foot removal and in some cases kneecap removal, both of which meant the condemned wouldn't be able to walk around very well at all. In other cases, they would remove a man's penis and testicles, which would make him a eunuch. But imagine that happened to you and then they still killed you. That was the 5th punishment. In Chinese, da pi. This is considered either cutting someone in 4, fen wei lu, boiling them alive, hang, or pulling their head and limbs off by connecting them to chariots, qi li. It might also have meant slow slicing, beheading, or simply strangulation. As for Li Si, he apparently lost his nose and then lost his manhood, after which he was sawn in half. an operation in which the executioner often worked slowly. For Li Si, all this was done in the market square. He was also sentenced to something called familial extermination, which meant members of his family were too killed in this brutal way. We're not sure if his son went that way. Records show Li Si's last words to his son as he was getting the chop were, "I wish that you and I could take our brown dog and go out through that eastern gate of Shanghai to chase the crafty hare." But how could we do that? During the Qin dynasty, the rule for familial extermination was that 3 clans had to go, so we guess that meant 3 generations of your family. Strangely enough, this happened to a lawmaker named Shang Yang. He'd written some very progressive legislation, but his humanity ensured he got on the wrong side of some of the Qin nobility. Part of their annoyance was Yang asking for equality before the courts, meaning that the elites also had to answer to the law. They didn't much like that. When they finally got him, they tied him to chariots and ripped him to pieces, which some sources say was an execution he'd written himself into the law. His entire family was also executed. Okay, so we just mentioned boiling alive, which is something we think we need to talk about some more. Number 4. Japanese officials did a fair bit of boiling people alive in their time, but we think one of the most shocking executions was that of the mean-looking bandit Ishikawa Goemon. In the 16th century, this guy was a bit of a hero to the poor, Japan's version of Robin Hood. He stole from the rich and gave to the poor, but let's always remember that legends such as this and Robin Hood might have been embellished over the years. For instance, the legend has it that Hideyoshi had ninja abilities, something like you might have seen in the movies, similar to stuff of fighting off 50 men at once and having the ability to jump high into the trees. Truth is, he was a thief, but also a man who stood up for the poor and detested the corruptions of the powers that be. So, when he tried to assassinate some of those powers, they wanted to make an example of him. One take on the tale is that he was boiled alive with his son, although it is said he saved his son by holding him above his head. Another variation, which sounds more true, is that he was thrown into a large kettle with his entire family, and they all died. Any case, you wouldn't last long if you were thrown into boiling water. Your organs would cook, but not before you felt a considerable amount of pain. This was witnessed by the crowd who watched a poisoner being boiled alive after England's King Henry VIII had made it the form of capital punishment for his offense. Maybe he thought someone would poison him, which was no doubt a real threat. Anyway, after they threw that man in the water, one witness later wrote, "He roared mighty loud, and women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw." Just months after that, a maid was also boiled alive for trying to poison the head of the house where she worked. That woman's name we can't find, but in 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy was also boiled alive in England for trying to knock off her employer. A book that came out later talked about her death, saying that the offender shall be boiled to death in hot water, upon which statute Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress, and some others was boiled to death in Smithfield the 17th of March in the same year. That book called Poisoning the Most Detestable of Crimes, which of course it was for the people who wrote the laws and hired folks to wash their floors and cook their stewed rabbit, but over in Germany and France, boiling alive was more often the sentence for clipping, which consisted of scraping bits off coins and then melting the bits to make new coins. It was an absolutely brutal form of execution because just like many of the punishments we're talking about today, it was supposed to inflict a lot of pain before death. In this respect, having your head chopped off by a sharp blade was bliss. But get this, what if the person was innocent of a crime like poisoning? After all, couldn't the owner of a large household just get sick from tainted food? Listen to this other piece of writing that came out after Margaret's death. The public was not satisfied as to her guilt, and notwithstanding the comparatively slow travel of news in those days, the story of Margaret Davy's trial and punishment soon spread through the kingdom and aroused universal horror. Harsh times indeed, but as you'll now see when it comes to being demented, the Romans were outstanding. Emperor Nero might have boiled hundreds of perceived enemies, but maybe he thought he was letting them off lightly. Number 3. Okay, question for you. Would you rather be boiled alive or attacked by a wild animal? Concerning the latter, if the animal doesn't get straight to some main arteries, it might feel like being eaten alive. As we know from the recordings that were never made public but were talked about in the movie Grizzly Man, being eaten alive can take a long time and involves one hell of a lot of screaming. The Romans had this as a form of death penalty, but also entertainment for the masses. It was the death sentence called damnatio ad bestias, which meant condemnation to the beasts. It actually appalled some Roman writers, but for the most part, it was great entertainment for the plebes who watched from the arena stands. This shouldn't be confused with gladiatorial sport, as the men who fought the animal simply could not win, which is why it fell into the damnatio category of punishments. Even if they'd somehow miraculously took out an elephant or a bear or a lion with their bare hands, they'd soon have another animal in front of them, or a sword. But there was a difference in some respects regarding dying this way. There was also the obrasere bestias, which meant being thrown to the beasts. In this case, you weren't even allowed to fight, you were just thrown to animals while in chains, or perhaps a Roman favorite, an elephant sat on you. There are a few records of this punishment being used when armies were defeated. In another case featuring some mutineers, a Roman writer recalled, before the eyes of the entire army he threw them to the elephants. All were trampled to death beneath the feet of the beasts. This also happened in India, Sri Lanka, and Siam, which is present-day Thailand. There, being thrown to elephants sounded a bit like elephant soccer. The beasts were trained to kick the condemned and throw them around, which soon resulted in death. Even more frightening was what a European man who came back from India said. This was a country where death by elephant wasn't uncommon at all. The traveler described how one man was forced to put his head on a block, after which the mahouts made the elephant step on the guy's head. Imagine the mess. A Moroccan traveler in India said an emperor he met loved to watch a good game of death by elephant, and that's why he went a step further than the Siamese and fitted the animals with blades on their feet. The traveler wrote they were ordered accordingly to be thrown to the elephants, which had been taught to cut their victims to pieces. Their hooves were cased with sharp iron instruments, and the extremities of these were like knives. Now for something you won't believe actually happened. Number 2. It was called the blood eagle. And unlike some punishments we've talked about today, it seems the Vikings were the only ones to do it. Imagine the scene. You're a king in England around the 9th century, and those pesky Vikings keep coming over and doing all that pillaging they're famous for. You tried having a pleasant sit-down with these guys over a glass of mead, but they really don't see things your way. Feeling just a bit peeved, you do something you really shouldn't. That's break your word and have that group of Vikings in front of you murdered. What do you think the Vikings will do in retaliation? According to some very old texts, once these guys had gotten a hold of you, they might have taken you to a kind of chopping block. You being an Anglo-Saxon think, okay, here we go, off with my head. But no, they cut through your back and proceed to pull out your ribs, which kind of gives you the impression that you have wings. But at that moment, they are hardly good wings, being bony and all, so they cut out your lungs and stretch them over the bones. Ta-da! You're an eagle, as featured on that bloody wonderful TV show Vikings. But did it ever happen? That's what you want to know. Word on the street, or at least in the artifacts, is yes, it very well may have gone down like that. As you already know, if something wasn't written into law or talked about in scores of old documents, there was always a chance the punishment was made up and used as propaganda to show people just how bad those baddies were. But according to modern scholars, the blood eagle punishment could definitely have been a thing. One of those old texts says this: Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the blood eagle on his back, in this fashion that he thrust his sword into his chest by the backbone and severed all the ribs down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs, and that was Halfdan's death. Halfdan was one of those royalty guys in the British Isles that the Vikings disliked. Then there was the case of that excellent Viking warrior named Ivar the Boneless, called that likely because his John Thomas never stood to attention. In the saga, The Tale of Ragnar's Sons, it said he went up to northern England and had it out with King Aella of Northumbria. Ivar apparently got a lot of the English on his side, who of course weren't really English back then, and he also captured the king. The saga says, and Ivar, the one who dwelt at York, had Aella's back cut with an eagle. Another take on the event goes, they caused the bloody eagle to be carved out of the back of Aella and then cut away all the ribs from the spine and then ripped out his lungs. With the right equipment and some amount of precision, it could have happened, although archaeologists have yet to find the remains of someone who might have been blood eagled. So far, there are 9 documented accounts of it happening, but if the writers of the sagas were just being poetic, we don't know. What is certain is that the Vikings dabbled in what scientists have called conspicuous mutilation, meaning that these violent acts had a meaning. As for the pain, one researcher said there is no possibility that a victim would have remained alive throughout the procedure. It is clear that a victim undergoing a full blood eagle would have died long before their ribs could have been formed into the shape of wings and their lungs externalized. We guess it couldn't have been that bad then. Okay, if you had to choose just one way to die from this list, we imagine not one of our viewers would choose this next one. Number 1. It's called rat torture. Back in the day, and still today to a lesser degree, there were a lot of rats in the city of London. It was sometime during the 16th century when word got around that the Tower of London had its very own Dungeon of the Rats. Documents from back then show that some of these cells at the bottom of the dungeon would let water in from the River Thames, and with it came the rats. That might have made someone a bit squeamish, but apparently at times flesh was torn from the arms and legs of prisoners. That's hardly death by rat, unless you count dying from an infection. But then there's also the documented story of the Dutch military leader named named Diedrich Sonoy, who said that during the 80 Years' War in the 16th and 17th centuries, they got creative with rats. In the book The Rise of the Dutch Republic, it's written that this guy put a few rats inside some bowl of some sort. He then placed that bowl on the belly of a prisoner. So far, not very frightening, but it's also said he heated the bowl up. So for the rats, there was only one place to escape the heat, and that was to bite and claw their way into the man's stomach. The book states that they'd gnaw into the very bowels of the victim, which you can imagine would be very painful and almost certainly lead to death. The entrance to the victim's belly would of course have been made easier to open if some slicing had been done beforehand. It's also very likely this was a form of torture during an interrogation, but it's likely the person died shortly after. Then there was rat torture medieval Germany style, which apparently consisted of starving some rats first. The victim then had a metal cage placed over his head into which the famished rats were stuffed. They would subsequently eat his face, and according to one source, the victim would be left to die that way. Admittedly, evidence of this happening is scarce. It seems quite unbelievable that anyone would do this to a person, but rat torture has been recorded happening as recently as the 1970s when death squads under the orders of dictators in South America decided it was a good idea. It happened during the Dirty War in Argentina from 1976 to 1983. Believe it or not, the USA was sponsoring and supporting this infinitely brutal military dictatorship, in which around 30,000 people went missing. Many of them were tortured in the worst imaginable ways before they were killed. The dictatorship was called itself Process of National Reorganization, functioned as part of the U.S. campaign called Operation Condor. The state of terror led to right-wing death squads taking anyone off the streets who voiced leftist views or even endorsed things we call human rights. Later, when Argentina's National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons wrote its reports, it was revealed that what had happened to some of the people before they disappeared was quite plainly evil. Even the ancient Romans would have winced. We won't go into detail, but the torture involved opening one of the person's orifices, after which a tube called a rectoscope was used, as well as a bunch of starving rats. Even if the victim survived, they might have been taken out on what became known as a death flight, meaning they were thrown from an aircraft or helicopter. This is all very grim indeed. But you know how the story goes. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Now you need to look at some other forms of execution we left out. In impalement, worst ways to die, or skinned alive, worst ways to die.